Should we get started? Okay. It's Monday, 4 o'clock, and what else could it be? It's the Washington History Seminar. Delighted to welcome all of you back. I think as I look around the room, I think most everybody's been here before, most everybody, but I think we'll, as usual, do a quick round of introductions around the room. Let me just say, by way of opening up, that Roger Lewis, my co-chair, I am delighted to welcome you all, to appreciate and acknowledge the support of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations for this seminar, to say that we owe thanks to the to the National History Center for co-sponsoring this event. Marian Barber, the associate director, is with us today, of course, to say that next week is Thanksgiving week, but we are continuing, and I think we're in for a treat with Phyllis Leffler on her project on Black leaders and leadership, and then the following week we have Jim Hirschberg, my predecessor as director of the Cold War Project, talking about his new 800-page volume on Vietnam. So, and then we'll have on December 5th Thomas Bender on American exceptionalism as the final round in this series. Let me, since this semester is fast coming to an end already, I'm afraid, say a particular word of acknowledgement and thanks to my co-chair Roger Lewis here, who flies up here every week, and really has been the spiritus rector behind this seminar series, and it's due to his tireless efforts that we have such stellar programs here, have had stellar programs, and I can tell you we just went over the spring program. We have a wonderful program coming up for the spring. It's already all set, so mark your Mondays, 4 p.m., and I think we'll have this program published very soon once the final titles have been confirmed. With that, let me turn to our feature speaker here today. Welcome back, Ron Steele, the award-winning writer, historian, and professor. He has been a fellow at the Wilson Center, not once, but twice. And he's currently Professor Emeritus of International Relations at the University of Southern California. His research has focused on American foreign policy, combining not only elements of history and political science, but also sociology, psychology, economics, and political anthropology. Prior to teaching at USC, he taught at Yale, Rutgers, Wellesley, Dartmouth, GW, UCLA, and Princeton. And he also served in the U.S. Army as well as the U.S. Foreign Service. Incredibly, on top of all of these activities, he's got a extensive bibliography to his credit, including a number of monographs, Pax Americana, as well as The End of Alliance, Temptations of a Superpower, Imperialists and Other Heroes, and of course, Walter Lippmann, The American Century, the definite biography of Walter Lippmann, which he will be talking about today. He has won most of the prestigious prizes that our profession can award, including the Bancroft Prize, as well as the National Books Critics Circle Award, and others. He has degrees from Northwestern and Harvard University, and it's wonderful to welcome him back and introduce him and give him the floor, but not without turning the mic over briefly to Roger.
I'll just say that long before Ron Steele had written the biography of Walter Lippmann, that he was famous, of course, above all for the book, The Pax Americana. When he published the biography on Lippmann, this was one of the major biographies of the last decades of the last century. And you would think that Lippmann was there to stay forever in the public mind. And yet one of the things that we've discovered in organizing this session is that there may be a generational dimension to Walter Lippmann, and people under a certain age, Walter Lippmann may not be so famous as he does appear to be to most of those in the room today. We would like to go through the ritual of asking everyone to introduce themselves with your affiliation, your purpose in life, if you will. Clint?
Yeah, I'm Kenton Clymer. I'm a fellow here and normally at Northern Illinois University.
My name is Mark Levinson. I'm an economic historian, unaffiliated, and I'm new to the seminar here.
Dick Arndt, former Foreign Service officer and cultural diplomat.
Stephen Shore.
Bill Milam, a senior policy scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Dave Rabinowitz, retired most recently with Oregon State University.
Robert Drucker, I teach at St. John's College in Annapolis.
John Wakeland, Emeritus Professor, Kent State University.
David Kyvig, former Wilson Fellow and Northern Illinois University Emeritus.
Nobuo Fukuda, journalist from Japan, currently at the Wilson Center. I read a few of Professor Steele's books in my college days.
Don Wolfensberger, do Congress Studies here at the Wilson Center.
Jim Grossman, American Historical Association, and I have to leave a little early, so when I duck out, it's not out of disgust for the conversation, just so you know.
Steve Weissman, I'm a political scientist.
Mickey Fabry, I'm a fellow here. Otherwise, I teach at Georgia Tech.
Hi, I'm Eugenia Schenecker, formerly at Labor Department.
Landis Jones, Professor Emeritus, University of Louisville.
Anna Nelson, History Department, American University.
Arnita Jones, American Historical Association, retired.
David Seepley, fellow at the Center and regularly political theorist at the University of Denver.
I'm Marley Clymer. I'm a retired nurse.
Al Schmidt, retired professor in history and law.
David McCain, I'm a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Bob Hathaway, I run the Asia program here at the Wilson Center.
Eric Arneson, a fellow at the Wilson Center and History Department at George Washington up the road.
I'm Marian Barber from the National History Center.
Well, Ron Steele, sorry.
Zed David, senior scholar here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Yelena Sitnikova. I'm historian from Russia. Nowadays, I'm a Fulbright scholar in Woodrow Wilson Center.
Yeah, my name is Yafeng Shah. I teach history at Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York. But this year, I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center.
Okay, here we go. Ron Steele on reassessing Walter Lippmann.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you, Roger and Christian. Thank you all for coming today. Nice to see many familiar faces and generational cohorts, because Lippmann is very much a generational figure, I've discovered. Younger people really either don't know the name or it doesn't evoke much. But be that as it may, biography is a special way of dealing with history, of course, and one of the special things about it is that the subject and the writer, the biographer, they're both partners and they're antagonists in a way. It's sort of like a contentious marriage, and one that's very difficult to get out of once one is embarked upon it. Maybe considering divorce rates these days, it's more binding than some marriages. And using that analogy, I don't want to convey that it's something out of Strindberg or O'Neill, but rather it's like a courtship, and it's also a contest, that each partner has his or her own motives, and it gives the biographer a potentially, at least, a powerful position, because in some sense he or she holds the life of the subject in his or her hands. So anyone who agrees to be the subject of a biography has to show a certain amount of trust and also of faith too. But also, I think, certainly in the case of Lippmann, that there's the sense on the subject, held by the subject, that whatever he had done would transcend what I had to say about him. So that also gave me a certain freedom. But in a sense, we both knew that he and I too would be judged by what I wrote about him. What I had never written a biography before, or even a short one, and I wasn't quite sure what I was getting into, which was just as well. I think I might have had second thoughts on how big a project it turned out to be. But I did come to fear the way in which he would take over my life, which of course he did. And then I had to ask myself, what right did I have to judge him? How could I know enough to do so fairly? And was I really being dispassionate in my assessment of him? Well, of course I did judge him. It'd be impossible not to. And I came to this project by invitation, if you will. It was at the suggestion of Richard Rovere, whom some of you may remember from his column in the New Yorker, who had originally thought of doing this and then just became overwhelmed by the amount of work that it entailed, and he didn't want to give up his daytime job at the New Yorker to do it. And so he suggested that I, in effect, take it over. Of course, why I shouldn't be alarmed as well. It was a thing that hadn't occurred to me. We had to bring Lippmann into this, though. He was still very much alive. He stopped writing his column, but he was very active. And Rovere was intimidated by Lippmann, and he was reluctant to confront him, if you will, with the news that he was, after all the preliminaries that had gone through when he embarked upon this project, that he was actually going to pull out. And so he hemmed and hawed and what have you, but ultimately Lippmann had seemed to have no trouble accepting this, and he'd read some other things I'd written, and so I guess he felt it was worth taking a chance. The perils for him were, for both of us, I think, were considerable. I could write a bad book, or at least be treated as a bad book, and he could come off in a way that would not be flattering and to him, and which he might resent and change people's opinion of him and what have you. As Oscar Wilde, the oft-quoted Oscar Wilde, said, "Biography adds to death a new terror." And indeed, that can be the case. But I think Lippmann was a very self-assured person, and he probably never thought that that history or I would seriously find him wanting. He gave me something that was absolutely essential on my part, exclusive and unrestricted access to his papers, which were then, for reasons not so interesting to go into, were at Yale rather than Harvard. Well, I'll tell you briefly why they're at Yale. He was part of the illustrious class of 1910 at Harvard, John Reed and T.S. Eliot among the others in that class. And Harvard just naturally assumed that they would get his papers when he retired. And he sent a scout to Harvard to see what they had done with the papers of his classmate, John Reed. And he discovered that they were sitting there in the packing boxes where they'd been for some decades, and Harvard never even cataloged them. And he had a friend at Yale Corporation, Wilmarth Lewis, who urged him to come to Yale. And he said, well, we'll give you a special room, a Walter Lippmann room, and we'll put a display of your works there. Can you hear me? Or should I talk closer to the mic? Sorry. And we'll make because we seriously want this. So that's why the papers ended up at Yale, which is a question that is often asked. The first thing I discovered was that, as going through these papers, was that he was much more involved in the nitty-gritty of politics than he let on in his column. He was far more than just an observer. He was an active participant in many cases. And he also, I discovered, had a much more interesting life than I realized, not that I had done any much background on him before. He began as an acolyte of Theodore Roosevelt, a student of Santa Ana and William James at Harvard, a founder of the New Republic magazine, an aide to Woodrow Wilson. He had put together the 14 points during World War I, and later was editor of the New York World before he started writing his column. And that he had a very rich life up to that point, and all kinds of experiences. And I had to figure out, aside from that, going through that biography, I had to figure out, why did he take certain stances that he did? Why did he were there it was simply on the pure basis of facts? Was he influenced by somebody? Were there pressures? What were some of the elements that went into his decisions? And Lippmann himself had made an offhand remark in an article he'd written in 1915 on John Dewey, in which he said, which Lippmann wrote, he said that philosophies are the very soul of the philosopher projected, and to the discerning critic may tell more than he knows about himself. In this sense, a man's philosophy is his autobiography. You can reveal in it the story of his conflict with life. Now, as a revealing statement, because Lippmann's own philosophy did reveal something about his life. Some of you have probably read his first book, A Preface to Politics, which is about Stoicism and what's now called secular humanism. I'm sorry. A Preface to Politics was indeed about politics. Preface to Morals was one of his later books, which was about how to deal with adversity and proper way, moral way to live, etc. And it's one that's deeply concerned with Stoicism. And it was, as I later discovered, emerged from the unhappiness that he was experiencing during the last unhappy years of his first marriage. Then there were surprising things about his political choices, like, as for example, in 1920, why did he choose to support the Wall Street lawyer John W. Davis instead of the Robert La Follette, the great progressive from Wisconsin? If you were doing a book on American history, you wouldn't devote much time to that, but in a work of biography, it becomes an interesting question. I didn't feel competent to analyze Lippmann, psychological examination, but I needed a lot of information, and he never volunteered any personal information. It was really pulling teeth to get it out of him. So I couldn't say, why did you divorce your first wife? Or why did you turn your back on Woodrow Wilson? Although that's not really a personal question. So I thought I'd start out with something simple. And I said, just what is it exactly, just for background, that your father did for a living? And he looked at me at a sort of fishy glance that he put on when he didn't like a question. And he turned to me and he said, I wouldn't want you to turn this into a novel. And he wouldn't tell me. So I thought it must be something shameful. So I had to do a lot of investigation. And I said, do you have any relatives in New York? And he said, oh, no, everybody's died. Well, I found a first cousin by looking in the phone book. And the first cousin told me that his father was a very wealthy real estate investor. He owned a lot of buildings, including tenements, which embarrassed Walter, and so he didn't want to talk about that. So that's a kind of limitation one has to deal with in writing biography. Also, he was not very forthcoming about his opinions of others. And I found that there's an unspoken conspiracy among people not to speak badly of another person if they're in a position to return the insult. And I was particularly struck by something that's more relevant today than it used to be. Igor Stravinsky once said that after 80, all contemporaries are friends. That was a very wise statement. When I got through some of the political material, if this was a biography, and I knew he had been married twice, and there was a first wife somewhere, and I asked him if he'd mind if I spoke to her. And he said, no, I don't mind. And I said, well, where is she? And he said, oh, I haven't the vaguest idea. And he wouldn't tell me. Well, a little investigation revealed that she was living in the country house that they had when they were married on Long Island. So I asked him if he had any objections. I said, guess what? I found your first wife. And do you have any objections? And he said no. And I talked to her on the phone. She was rather reluctant to see me if he disapproved. So I got a little note from him saying, I, Walter Lippmann, have no objection to interviewing Faye Alberson. Heatley was her name by that time. But I've really felt I had to see her, and after I did, I couldn't understand what brought these two people together. It did seem to be a doomed marriage. But I did learn something from her just in her offhand remarks. Sometimes these are the most interesting things about doing a biography. It's not the kind of questions that you necessarily think of asking or expect to get an interesting answer. But she dropped an offhand remark about traveling in the Green Mountains and going to a hotel where at the registration it said Jews not allowed or something the equivalent of that. Maybe they phrased it a little less dramatically. It was something, a part of his life that he never talked about, and yet obviously was something that I had to try to figure out. And with the help of one of my students at Yale, I was teaching a seminar at Yale as a visitor on Walter Lippmann. And the students, as many of you know who teach, sometimes can come up with really interesting things that one wouldn't necessarily have thought of oneself. And I had a student who was from Cincinnati, and where the what's it called, the American Hebrew Association or something like that. I've forgotten the exact title. Hebrew Union College, yeah, had an archives. And there was an interesting correspondence between Lippmann and the editor that revealed that this was not simply an intellectual subject. And it also, I thought, I don't want to make too much of this, but I thought it shed some light on the surprising silence in his column about the Nazi treatment of the Jews and even about the Holocaust. And then later, about his relationship with Felix Frankfurter, which started out as a very close friendship and ended in bitterness for reasons that I had to unearth myself. A long correspondence went on for years, and then suddenly the correspondence stopped. And I couldn't get him to tell me, but I eventually figured it out. It was over a column that he had written. Just to bring the biography up to date, he lived in Washington. He lived in New York, and then when his marriage fell apart, and he married his second wife. That's a whole other story. I don't want to go into that today. He moved to Washington, and he and his wife lived here for the rest of their. Then they moved to Washington, and then ultimately, when he stopped writing his column, they moved back to New York, and he died at the age of 80. Rogers has said, with good reason, I think, that Lippmann's a rather neglected figure today. And why is that? His journalism is not just today, it's about tomorrow and yesterday. And in many ways, he was less a journalist than he was an essayist. And his column was a small essay. Although he had been editor of Pulitzer's World, which is very, very much a newspaper man. The kind of career he had, I think, would be very difficult today because of the democratization, if you will, of opinion by social networks, where every opinion is considered to be valid, the decline of newspapers, the rise of partisanship, and it makes periodically I find myself asking, is there, or somebody might ask me, is there a Walter Lippmann today? Is there an equivalent to Walter Lippmann today? And I think there is, but he doesn't get much
the kind of attention he deserves because he doesn't have a newspaper, and that's William Pfaff, if some of you read him on the internet. I think he's by far the most thoughtful commentator that I know. I don't know how he keeps it up, but I greatly admire him for that. Now, what was unique about Lippmann? He had a classical education, which is to say in Latin and Greek and what have you, at a New York prep school. What's unique, he went to Harvard and had very close relations, personal relations with people like William James and Santayana. He chose journalism as a career, not academia, not Wall Street, or not business like his father, but journalism. And part of that was his attraction to reporting that he was doing at Harvard itself. He had a remarkable collection of acquaintances. When he was still very young, started right out of college, he knew Theodore Roosevelt, worked with Woodrow Wilson. As I said, was a founder of the New Republic, was involved with the Fabians. He was also a government insider. He worked with Woodrow Wilson, was involved in writing the 14 Points, and even at the Peace of Paris. He was immensely versatile. He wrote 10 books and 13 compilations. And his first book, A Preface to Politics, was written when he was only 24. He had a really wide-ranging mind. It was not only about foreign policy, but culture, science, evolution, philosophy, literary criticism even. What did he offer to his readers? Well, not solutions, but what he tried to achieve, which was dispassionate analysis. He could simplify the complex. He had a great gift for that, I think. He had the logician's mind that could grasp the essence of a problem, and he had a lucid literary style. He had, in effect, a kind of intellect not normally or rarely drawn to journalism. But why did he choose journalism with that background? Because he wanted to be in the action. He feared that academia was too isolating. He wanted to be part of the excitement. He wanted the excitement of doing something. He rejected active political life, though, of course, because he distrusted emotionalism, and he hated the kind of insincerity that goes with political life. And journalism combined two things that he wanted, was involvement and detachment. And within journalism, he also lived two lives, one of newspapers and one of books. And I think that each gave a kind of dimension to his life, and gave him his voice a kind of authority. I think journalists who write books are usually find that they have a somewhat different kind of audience from the books and the journalism that enhances their reputation as journalists. Altogether, he wrote 10 major books and 14 compilations while writing his newspaper column, which is quite an achievement. He naturally enjoyed being famous and influential. He even made the Broadway stage. In Rodgers and Hart's Pal Joey, there is one of the which is one of the lines is a stripper was is doing Gypsy Rose Lee. I'm just not Pal Joey, it's something else. Anyway, Gypsy Rose Lee even had something during one of her routines about Walter Lippmann in a song called Zip, and as she takes off whatever it is she's removing, she's saying, "Zip, Walter Lippmann wasn't brilliant today. zip, will Soroyan ever write a great play? And it goes on like that. Rogers and Hart were wonderful. I mean, and this influence gave them a power over public opinion. So they each fed the other. And power over public opinion means power over politicians and policies. I think it's fair to say that for many readers, including me, when I certainly remember reading his column in the 60s, depended on him to know how to think about certain issues, or certainly we had to consider his views. So he was definitely a man of reason, yet he remarkably, at the age of 80, or nearly 80, he embarked upon a bitter political fight, one of the most vituperative of his career, and he hated direct encounter and emotion. A bitter fight with Lyndon Johnson over the Vietnam War, which he called immoral and corrupting, at a time when eminent columnists didn't use words like that. He was saved from cynicism and withdrawal because he believed that politics mattered. He believed that men could live a life of reason, and that those with the gift of understanding had a responsibility to protest and to act. So I want to talk a little bit about some of his books now. His first big book was Public Opinion, written in 1922, a book which is still in print to this day, is used widely in classes. It emerged from the experience of the First World War, which shook the belief of traditional political science that the average man could make reasonable decisions if presented with the facts. However, the question that Lippmann posed, which has made the book interesting, was what if these facts that were presented were blocked by propaganda, ignorance, and distortion? What, that is, did it mean if opinion itself could be manufactured? So the manufacture of consent, which is one of his chapters, raised and tried to deal with this problem. In a book that he'd written just before that, a short book called Liberty in the News, he argued that the traditional theories of government they were taught in universities, the legislature and the executive and the congressional, et cetera, where the branches of government, he said that these traditional theories of government were outmoded because they failed to take one thing into account, which is the role of public opinion. And he wrote, quote, "The decisions in the modern state are made by the interaction, not of Congress and the executive, but of public opinion and the executive," which was a striking comment. We take it for granted now, I think, but at the time it opened a whole new door. John Stuart Mill had argued that the press must be free for liberty to survive. We were always taught that. But this doesn't answer the question that Lippmann raised. What if the press is free, print what it wants, but fails to do its job of providing unbiased news and unbiased information? And a good example of that was reporting on the Russian Revolution, which was scandalously opinionated and biased and inaccurate. Even more, what if people, the best will in the world, couldn't make rational judgments, even based on what they had read? So the role of irrationality in news, both in the presentation of it and in the reception of it, was a door that was opened by this book, and I think it contributes to its great and lasting importance. Because traditional democratic theory is oblivious to the fact that not only could facts be distorted, One can accept that propaganda. But the issue that Lippmann raised, and this is from his involvement with Freudians too. He's one of the first people to, in America, to write about Freud. That came indirectly from his involvement with Mabel Dodge, was a whole other story. But what if not only the facts could be distorted, but the distortion was embedded in the human mind? That the images in people's minds is reflected through not the pure stream of consciousness, but through emotions, habits, and prejudices. And as he wrote in one of the many memorable sentences in that book, he says, "We do not first see, then define. We define first, then see." And looking at it that way, it has you can see the immense conflict that creates. He said, "We create what he called a pseudo-environment," unquote. We have to, and not only is this, do we do this? We don't do this perversely. That it's necessary to impose order, to impose order on a chaotic world. And how do we define? We define according to not to what's out there, but since we see according to our stereotypes, we define according to our stereotypes. Every day, people are asked to make judgments about events that they cannot experience firsthand. So there's a disconnect there. And one of the many troubling things in that book, he says, if the pictures inside people's heads are not an accurate reflection of the world, then the whole theory of popular government is corroded. And that says tremendous implications. So his remedy for that is that even reliable news is too complex for the average man, if news does not equal truth, how could competent opinions be formed? And his answer to this was not better reporting, because he assumes the best reporting in the world is still subject to prejudice, but what he described as intelligence bureaus. There would be trained people who presumably would be able to free themselves from stereotypes. But, as he said, there's an inherent problem. And I quote him here, he said, quote, "The common interests elude public opinion entirely and can be managed only by a specialized class." So, Lippmann, of course, is, we would call him an elitist, but what he was describing was a situation where the average reader is not capable of making that decision. This has all kinds of anti-democratic or undemocratic connotations. And John Dewey, who was deeply impressed by the book, but not in a favorable way, described it as, quote, "the most effective indictment of democracy ever penned." And one can see what he means by that. The problem is, yes, the reader has pictures in their heads that distort their sense of the news. But the question that it raises is, what if the experts also have pictures in their heads? So it leads to a skepticism about the presentation of the news and the effect this has on public policy. Critics hailed this book, some critics anyway, hailed this book for revealing a problem that few political scientists recognized or even knew existed. Conservatives liked it. They liked its pessimism about the wisdom of the people. But liberals were troubled, however, had no answer to the question that he had raised. Lippmann followed up that book with a second one called The Phantom Public, 3 years later, 1925. in which he carried his argument from public opinion to its logical conclusion. He said, there was no such thing as a public to direct events, only interested individuals. The role of the public, he argued, was to signal those capable of making decisions and then choose between the outs and the ins. So he was arguing you cannot ask the public to make these sophisticated judgments about the presentation of the news. You have to rely on the political process, choosing outs if you're unhappy with the ins, and do it in that unsatisfactory way. But this is unavoidable, he wrote, because, quote, with the substance of a problem, the public can only meddle ignorantly. So you can, and further, that problems that vex democracies, this is a quote, are unmanageable by democratic methods. So what is the justification for majority rule? And he wrote, not in any ethical superiority, but in the need to find a place for simple numerical majorities. H.G. Wells wrote about this problem, picking up from Lippmann's analysis, and his solution was what he called a new order of samurai, specially trained and people. Lippmann was also, as many other people were too, I think, influenced by the Scopes so-called monkey trials about Darwin's theories. And he wrote that what it revealed was the powers of a majority, but majority rule is not a moral principle, he insisted, but only a political device. It was, in effect, a method of avoiding civil war. As I said, it's not surprising this book had an influence, that it's still read widely. Every couple of years there's a new edition of Public Opinion with a new introduction by some journalist or academic. And of all his writings, I think that's probably the most influential. Later, there were other books, The Preface to Morals, which I think was not a successful book, in which he was espousing his stoicism and detachment in dealing with the world. By the end of the 1920s, his own personal situation changed. He'd been editor of the New York World, which is the greatest paper of its day, the Pulitzer paper. The paper was sold to Scripps Howard chain and had changed dramatically. It was not what Pulitzer had created. And Walter Lippmann was invited at that point by Helen Reed, who was from the family that owned the New York Herald Tribune, to come and write a column. Now, he'd written editorials, but writing a column was something that gossip mongers did, Walter Winchell, that sort of thing. But a serious political column was not yet a phenomenon of newspapers. But he decided to give it a try, and he gave it a title, Today and Tomorrow, and that remained the title throughout the long life of his column, and it was a great success. He continued writing that column for the Herald Tribune and Syndicate until the 1960s. He had an interesting relationship with Keynes. became a convert to Keynesianism and going off the gold standard. During the Depression, interestingly, although he was not a great admirer of Franklin Roosevelt, he wrote, I suppose not surprisingly, so after all, he said that Roosevelt might have to assume, quote, dictatorial powers, unquote, to deal with the roadblock in Congress and to get his program through. And reading this, Roosevelt predicted that it wouldn't be long before Lippmann started writing against him, and he found Lippmann in the opposition, which did happen pretty quickly. He became an advocate of Keynes and contracyclical spending, which of course is we're used to today, and insisted that, consistent with his belief that democracy could be saved only by a disinterested elite, the so-called like Wells's New Order of Samurai. In 1934, no, I'm sorry, in 1933, on Inauguration Day in 1933, banks in 38 states were closed, and Hitler had just come to power. Lippmann told Roosevelt that he must assume dictatorial powers, and he wrote, "Popular government is unworkable except under the leadership of a strong national executive. Congress must not be allowed to obstruct, to delay, to mutilate, and to confuse. Should give the president a free hand. Quote, dictatorial powers is essential." And he pointed out that a democracy which fails to concentrate authority in an emergency falls into such confusion that the ground is prepared for the rise of a dictator. And of course, he had European examples to work from. He justified granting far greater powers than Roosevelt actually sought. 5 or 10 minutes left. Okay. Let me just cut this. Zip ahead. However, he urged Roosevelt to assume dictatorial powers, but by 1937, he denounced the New Deal as a step toward authoritarianism and declared planning was incompatible with human freedom. I think he thought that he could explain totalitarianism by a search for economic security. It was hard for him to accept the emotional appeal of mass movements. Although he accepted the welfare state, he feared collectivism, and he wrote at that time, quote, "When times are out of joint, some storm the barricades and others retreat to a monastery." He tried to avoid the middle way. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about Lippmann and Kennan. Kennan's in the news these days because of John Lewis's wonderful biography, John Lewis Gaddis's wonderful biography. At Yalta, at the Yalta Conference in 1945, FDR tried to play the role of mediator between the rival imperialisms of Churchill and Stalin. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, a Michigan Republican, was a delegate to that conference and sort of an acolyte of Lippmann, and declared that a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe was, quote, perfectly understandable, end quote. Avro Harriman, who at that time was ambassador to the Soviet Union, was so outraged that he declared at the San Francisco conference that our objectives and the Kremlin's objectives are irreconcilable. Lippmann was alarmed that what he called hardliners at the State Department were pushing for a showdown with Russia. And he wrote an angry column against those who were, quote, thinking of using the international organization as a means of policing the Soviet Union. Quote, we cannot police the Soviet Union. We must not flirt with the idea of attempting it. There was those who favored Roosevelt's policy of cooperation, Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, and James Burns, who was at that point Secretary of State. Lippmann warned Burns against taking an anti-Soviet position and feared that if the United States and Britain quarreled, they would start wooing the Germans in a race for military advantage. He was suspicious of Britain's role in trying to resume a position in Eastern Europe and in the Mediterranean. I'm trying to cut this. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech at Fulton in March 26th, in which he said that God had willed the American nuclear arsenal, and an open repudiation of Burns's attempt to Secretary of State Burns to deal with the Soviets. Lippmann warned against provoking antagonism with Moscow, and deplored what he called a direct incitement to preventive war within the next 5 years. He was concerned that the British sought a showdown with Russia for the control of Germany, and were secretly keeping Wehrmacht units intact in their zone, in the richest part of their occupation zone in the Ruhr. Lippmann wanted to keep the U.S. atomic monopoly. He never saw disarmament as a way to prevent war. While George Kennan saw the Soviets as ideological fanatics, Lippmann saw them as defensive and fearful of a revived Germany. He charged that American-British policy in late 1946 gave the Russians ground to believe a coalition was being organized to destroy them, but believed that a settlement was still feasible. But the mood in Washington was not receptive, and the Kennan article, the famous X article, which appeared in 1947, soon revealed to be Kennan, based on his long telegram from Moscow, laid out the new policy. The long telegram declared that this quote, Kennan had written that the Soviets are, quote, committed fanatically to the belief that with the United States there can be no permanent modus vivendi, the internal harmony of our society be disrupted, our traditional way of life destroyed, and the international authority of our state be broken. This could be countered only by a vigilant application of counterforce, resulting in the breakup or mellowing of Soviet power. Appearing in Foreign Affairs, it was viewed by many as a semi-official administration policy, which it was, and Lippmann deeply disagreed with this policy, which is enunciated by Kennan, but reflected the position of people, prominent people in the State Department. And he wrote 14 consecutive columns in his Today and Tomorrow columning, to which he gave the name Cold War, the Cold War, as a name to the U.S.-Soviet competition. He tried to refute Kennan point by point. He said emphasis on Marxist ideology is a distortion. Stalin was following Peter the Great. Russians were in Europe not because of Marxist ideology, but because of German aggression, and remain there because of historical fears for their security. Second, the so-called containment doctrine was a, quote, strategic monstrosity doomed to fail. It would mean, quote, recruiting, subsidizing, and supporting a heterogeneous array of satellites, clients, dependents, and puppets. This would, unquote, require unending American intervention. Confronted with demands for intervention, the U.S. would have to, quote, disown our puppets, which would be tantamount to appeasement and loss of face. Instead of containment on the periphery, Lippmann urged a political settlement in Europe in which both the Americans and the Russians would withdraw their troops, and Germany would be unified and demilitarized. These articles in which Lippmann espoused these views were printed in a short book called The Cold War, and of course the phrase entered the world's vocabulary. Kennan, when he'd calmed down and had retreated to Princeton, later wrote that it rested on a, quote, misunderstanding almost tragic in its dimensions, unquote. But when he could have disavowed the military interpretation of containment, he chose not to do so. However, by the late 1950s, Kennan revived Lippmann's troop withdrawal plan under his own label of, quote, disengagement, unquote. I'm going to stop there, so I'll give you, because I've talked long enough.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry to have interrupted there and probably rattled you a little bit, but I do want to leave some time for questions. It was an immensely stimulating and rich presentation, and I know there will be many questions. I certainly have a number. Let's start with Don back there. We'll make our way around the table.
Thank you, Ron, for that. It was very, I think it was very informative. I wondered if you could just flesh out a little bit more about the relationship between his views on public opinion, the dangers of public opinion, and his relationship, for instance, with Woodrow Wilson at a time when Wilson was staging, a huge public relations effort to get people to support our involvement in the war. Was Lippmann involved with that at all?
He was.
Or did he just see that as a just cause in the true way, and so he didn't really see any conflict with his views on manipulating public opinion?
He was a manipulator of opinion during the war, so he was very much involved in that. He was on George Creel's Committee of Public Information, I think it was called, wasn't it? And one of his duties in the war, he was quite young then, he was mid-20s, was to write propaganda to be dropped behind the German lines. And so that what he later called the manufacture of consent was something that he himself had been deeply involved in and was very aware of the dangers it could cause.
Okay. Sure. But hold on until you get the microphone.
Yes. Could people please re-identify themselves?
My name is Stephen Shore. I'm newly re-identified. I appreciate your talk, and Ron, you've done the best to raise the dead, but by quoting one misjudgment after another, I'm not at all clear as to what benefit is whether the dead, in fact, can be raised.
Well, fair enough. I don't think I was trying to raise the dead, but simply to put a spotlight on them. I mean, here was a particularly articulate observer who was thinking deeply about these issues, who was using the new science of psychology to explain politics in a way that it hadn't been understood before. I think he was fallible in his judgments. Later on, some of them were proved to be erroneous. But he was one of the first people to deal with the whole question of psychology and politics, and I'm not subscribing to all of his views, but to express what they were and how, and as a journalist, he was reaching an audience and how he was justifying these views and trying to influence opinion in that way. I think that I personally think so many of his criticisms were fair, but that's neither here nor there.
Mm-hmm. Dave Rabinowitz. Thank you for the talk. This is probably an unfair question, but I don't know if you've been approached by anybody from Hollywood, but if you were to do a movie adaptation of this book, realizing you have to cut it to 90 minutes or so, what would be the plot arc? I mean, there's so much stuff to cover. What do you see as the major storyline with the conflict that would make a film?
I'll tell you what Hollywood thought was the plot line for this. It almost was made, almost twice. It was picked up by Paul Newman, who wanted to do it, and his wife Joanne Woodward, as Lippmann's second wife, Helen, and they had a screenplay written. Then they didn't like the screenplay with the part. Paul Newman was a lovely man, but he said the part isn't big enough for Joanne, and can't do it this summer. I got to race my cars, that sort of thing. So it dragged on, and then it just got lost. And then a little bit later, what was his name? A comic actor. I can't remember his name. Anyway, somebody else took another option on it for ABC, and to do it as a TV thing, Richard something, and that didn't work out either. What would be the plot line though of the thing? I think. Well, I'll tell you what they thought would be the plot line was the affair, the divorce, and the remarriage. And I think that was dramatic. There was a film that came out a long time ago. I think it was just called Wilson, and it was about the tribulations. Was it? Yeah, tribulations of Woodrow Wilson in politics. And it's fine. It's a smaller. Richard Dreyfuss, that was the other person who bought it. But what was the plot line? I think that you could do a plot line, I suppose, of Lippmann confronting FDR, that sort of thing. I think it's going to be for a limited audience, but I wish it had been done. But now
but
it's too
Ron,
late.
one of your persistent themes seems to be the authoritarian personality of Lippmann, but he always pulls back. I remember reading once that I do not intend to disenfranchise my fellow citizens, but it's a very delicate.
Yeah. But people like movies about authoritarian characters. Consider Patton. And Huey Long. Yeah.
David Kyvek?
David Kyvek. I remember reading Walter Lippmann in the American Century shortly after it came out, and I was quite taken with your presentation, and it shaped my thinking about the Cold War quite a bit. But my question is, what has happened since the book was published that historiographically or substantively has caused you to reconsider any of your judgments about Walter Lippmann? Did the way the Cold War unfolded in the decade after you wrote have an impact on your thinking, or has anything else in the last, I hate to admit how much I've aged since I first read the book, but in the last 30 years has your judgment shifted?
About Lippmann.
About Lippmann.
His choices, you mean? No, I don't think so. I think that his critique often went against the grain, but I thought it was well-founded as a way of looking at foreign policy issues and try to take these into account. I think that his criticism of Kennan, I think, was justified. I think that given the difficulties of making far-reaching decisions based upon inadequate information, which is what any journalist has to do, I think he's held up quite well. I can't think of any major issue, at least off the top of my head, where I would have, where I think he went seriously wrong. Some of you may disagree with that.
Okay. Yep. Mickey Fabry, you mentioned various foreign policy positions, specific positions that Lippmann held, as well as his disagreements with Kennan. But I'm wondering whether you can say that there was a discernible philosophy of international relations that he held sort of consistently throughout his life. And if there was such a philosophy, do you think it's still relevant in the world today?
Oh, gosh. A consistent philosophy, I think that I think he believed in a strong role for the United States in the world. I think he believed that it should be divorced from the vagaries of public opinion and emotion. At least I can't right at the moment think of something about which I would seriously disagree. I think he went wrong. Some of you may disagree, and maybe you do. I'd like to. I would welcome hearing it.
He recommended in one of his...
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, attacking... He was so incensed with the Russo-Finnish war that he recommended attacking Russia, which would not have helped us ultimately in World War II.
Oh, indeed, it wouldn't have. No.
Why don't you pass your microphone down to the next?
Yeah. His experience in CPI with George Creel was not entirely without tensions. He got into a spat with Woodrow Wilson about some boorish crony from Trenton, New Jersey, who misbehaved in Paris and so forth. I've always thought public opinion was a very sophisticated response to the CPI experience, and that its great virtue was that it warned us about Mussolini and Goebbels and Hitler and the whole gang of them, and not to mention some contemporary artists who believe still that if you repeat a fact, or a so-called fact enough, it becomes true. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. Yeah. No, I think it's as I said, that book really holds up very well today. I mean, he put his finger on something at the very beginning of recognition of public opinion as a phenomenon in itself, and the consequences of it. I thought that his application of psychology to politics was prescient. And really quite striking, and so influenced the field. That's just why the book keeps being reprinted.
And his colleague in CPI was
microphone. Otherwise,
Bernays.
After all, his brother-in-law.
Yes.
Brother-in-law of Freud. Since we've gotten to Freud.
And the father of public relations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The father of spin is what his biography.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Okay. The gentleman back there.
John Wakelin again. You did stop before 1956, and that's appreciable. But, of course, the public philosophy are those of us who think that may have been his greatest book, even more than Public Opinion. And I think in terms of finding some kind of core thinking for Lippmann over the years, even though he evolved from the quasi-socialist undergraduate, to place him in not small c, modern conservatism, but classical American conservatism, despite Louis Hart's, in a tradition of, say, from John Adams on, that perhaps public philosophy, which is also in print and still taught, may be his greatest book because it finally declared him, and I would love your opinion on this, in a classically large C conservative model.
Yeah, I think it does, and I'm glad it's still in print. I think that it has, maybe it's not as well known. Maybe it's not so often reprinted as public opinion, because it doesn't have practical application in the same way that the public opinion book does. But it was his attempt at writing a serious philosophical tract, and I think he always wanted to do that. And I think that it was a brave thing of him to decide to do it, and so he really. And it indicated, or just confirmed again, that he really did have, or tried to, as long as he could, have two lives, one of books and one of journalism. And that's where he was, it was in books. Which one won?
Which one won out? Journalism or
well, in terms
books?
of his in terms of what he cared about, or in terms of how the public views him?
Oh. Good question. I don't know. Both.
I think that probably the books, because there's nothing as dead as yesterday's newspaper, and so these issues that he wrote so passionately about, like the Vietnam War, for example. Yes, he was one of the many critics of the war and of Lyndon Johnson, and I think he influenced a lot of people then, etc. But you can read about old crises only so long, and it's not going to change your way of thinking about how to deal with the news, how to deal with the world. I think he was trying to do something much more in the thoughtful books like Public Opinion and Public Philosophy.
Okay, Kenton Clymer. We'll go to Kenton first, and then.
Hi, Kenton Clymer. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the relationship with Kennan. I know and fully understand the break over the origins of the Cold War, but in many respects they're very similar people with very similar ideas, it seems to me. They're both conservatives in that sense. They're both elitists. They're both skeptical of democracy. Kennan's book, The American Diplomacy, 1900 to 1950, is entirely about the dangers of irrationality in foreign policy, and it ought to be decided by a group of experts, Kennan himself, of course, in a sense came over to Lippmann's view when he disliked the way containment was being implemented. They both shared skepticism about the war in Vietnam. I just wondered if was there ever a reconciliation? Did they, or can you say more about that relationship?
I don't know that I can. There's really much more I can say about that. They didn't have a break, exactly. I mean, they always remained on good terms. I think when Kennan first became prominent with the long telegram and the X article, Lippmann took strong exception to that, and I think that it was justified. I mean, I think the issue on which the phenomenon on which they disagreed, or at least didn't come together, was Kennan's extreme emotionalism. He was a person who was often guided by his emotions, and Lippmann was somebody who I think, tried to valued reason above all else. And the only time in his life that I think he seriously became emotional was in his love affair. When he left his first wife and married the wife of his best friend. That was an emotional thing, but he didn't. I don't think he applied emotion to politics. And I think that's a hallmark of Kennan, I think.
Okay, go ahead.
Елена Ситникова. I don't remember exactly how many presidents changed during the journalist career of Walter Lippmann, but I know that some of them prefer to work together with Walter Lippmann. Some of them can choose time to meet with them. But I met information that only one president didn't meet with Walter Lippmann. It was 33rd President of the United States, Harry Truman. Do you know, it's very interesting for me, why he didn't want to meet with Walter Lippmann?
Oh, that's first, I didn't know that was the case, actually. And I have no idea why. I suppose Lippmann had probably written something unflattering about Truman, and Truman was very hypersensitive. For a politician, he should be used to terrible things being said about him. I mean, Truman just had the thinnest skin. Lippmann described Franklin Roosevelt before he became president as being what do you say? A superficial young man. Yeah, that's it. With no, but the important thing is what you got. Yeah, exactly. But an unqualified man who'd very much like to be president. Right, just rolled right off Roosevelt's back. He invited him to Warm Springs, and he invited him to the White House, and he was Roosevelt had what one of his biographies said is a first-class temperament, and he didn't make enemies, and he certainly went to great effort not to, and so these criticisms would roll off his back, and Truman was just quite the opposite. But I mean, he'd go and sulk. I mean, can you imagine? You can't imagine Stalin going and sulking if somebody gives him writes nasty things about him. But in that sense, there's a parallel between Truman and George Kennan, who would sulk all the time if he felt somebody was not respectful to him or didn't like him or what have you. I mean, never mind.
Okay, we're just about out of time. I've got 3 people here, so we'll just take those together and then give Ron a final chance to respond. So, go ahead.
Okay, David Seepley. So Lippmann, early in his career, became disenchanted with the basic competence of the public. And then he adopted a view quite typical of progressives at that time of kind of belief in what I've called elsewhere expert progressivism, a kind of strong executive with expert guidance involved. And then he became a critic of the New Deal, but still believed in the notion of, some kind of a strong executive or expert body necessary as a kind of bulwark against the kind of disorder of an industrial economy under these depression conditions. So again, a kind of advocacy of a stronger executive. Then in 1937, Roosevelt put forward his executive reorganization plan, which would have fulfilled many of these kind of old progressive ideals, kind of giving the president more control over this alphabet soup of agencies. And initially Lippmann supported it. And then the so-called Supreme Court packing plan came down, and he changed his mind, and he came out strongly against executive reorganization as well. No longer now a strengthened American presidency as bulwark against dictatorship, but itself a kind of step toward dictatorship. So at this point, Lippmann is out of sympathy with public opinion. He's out of sympathy with a strong executive. He never had much faith in Congress. He played with the idea of the courts taking a somewhat more leading role in public in the good society, but that wasn't very realistic. So I'm just wondering, I wonder if by this point in his career, in terms of kind of image of what American government should look like, if he was just kind of out of answers and at sea.
I think he often was, and I think that's a problem that's endemic to writing a newspaper column. I think that he, since he had to express an opinion 3 times a week on issues, and since he was subject to, it prevented him the luxury of sitting down and reflecting as much on this as an academic could, for example, or somebody who just wrote books. And I think that that he did often contradict himself or change his views, and he wasn't totally consistent by any means. But I mean, you obviously know a lot about his role then and his opinions.
Steve Weissman, I was wondering, how has journalism looked at his legacy? Because in a way he was a very unusual journalist if you look at it from today's perspective. He was very cosmopolitan. He had wide acquaintance in Europe and elsewhere. He was a person who had a coherent philosophy, as some people have mentioned and you've mentioned, foreign affairs. And he was courageous. He was someone who would be wined and dined by the White House, like Johnson did, in order to get him to accept Johnson's professed intentions about the Vietnam War, and then he'd conclude eventually on his own that this was not adequate and oppose him when that was very unusual. How has journalism, you mentioned all the broad trends that have kind of made a Walter Lippmann practically impossible today, but I'm wondering how have journalism schools, how has the profession of journalism looked at his legacy, or have they ignored it?
Hold on. We'll go to in what has become by now a tradition as our final questioner, Professor Nelson. When it's past the time, so.
Well, it's a quick question, but it fits in a way. It's the later part of Lippmann's career. I wonder if he had an influence over Fulbright, or if he had a relationship with Fulbright, given their kindred, they were kindred spirits in terms of the Vietnam War.
You know, I don't know about Fulbright. I knew Fulbright. I worked for Fulbright even in the 60s. Fulbright's name doesn't really come up in the correspondence. It didn't come up in any research on that I did. I don't recall, because it was way back when, what Fulbright had to say about Lippmann. I assume that they were on good terms, since they agreed particularly on the war. But I don't have any information on that.
It's legacy for journalism.
Yeah, legacy for journalism. How did I can't tell you from the inside how journalism schools look at Lippmann today. I don't know if they teach him. I just don't know how to answer that. I think he's the sui generis. You know, he doesn't really fit into the pattern of journalism as it's so often practiced today. And with the disappearance of newspapers, I think what we're having clearly is more people expressing opinions than we ever had before. So clearly there are junior Walter Lippmanns out there all the time expressing their opinions. But he's an atypical journalist in many ways, I think.
I think we'll have to leave it at that. Please join me in a round of applause for Ron Steele. It was a very interesting, rich afternoon. Thank you.